I'm going to start off by talking for a few minutes, just in a relatively big picture way, setting up the issues. And then Z's going to come in and like hit you with the punchline, do the details, right? Okay. So here's an intuition. Nothing could be mass if it doesn't act like mass. So maybe this seems pretty trivial, right? How else could mass act if not like mass? But the kind of idea is supposed not to be trivial. The intuition is supposed to be that if there is some property in some possible world that does not act like mass does in our world, then it's not mass. So for example, it can't be the case that there's some other world and there's mass in that world, but in that world, mass acts in the way that like inflation does in our world, right? So this kind of intuition implies that in any possible world, if there is the property mass, then that property must act like mass does in our world. That is to say, it implies that mass plays the mass role necessarily, where the mass role is kind of mass's nomic connections to other stuff, right? So for example, mass in our world roughly determines the degree to which a body resists changes in its motion, right? Given this kind of intuition, that would be necessary. That would not just be a contingent fact about our world. So a kind of similarly attractive intuition, I think this initial intuition is attractive. I think a similarly attractive intuition runs in the opposite direction. So if something acts like mass, then it is mass. So if we know that some property plays the mass role, then we don't need to do any further investigation to find out what it is. So it's mass, we're done, right? So call views which satisfy both these intuitions Nomic Essentialist views or Nomic Essentialism. Though there are some terminological complexities here because the views I just laid out, the intuitions I laid out were modal views, but rather than ones about essence. If we have time at the end, Z is going to talk about the interaction between the modal and the essential, but call it Nomic Essentialism for now. Okay, so Nomic Essentialism, I think, is a pretty attractive view. In particular, like one of the main attractions is that it rules out the possibility of this kind of unintuitive property switching. So if Nomic Essentialism were false, then it seems like it would be possible for like mass and charge to just switch roles in some other possible world. So there could be two possible worlds, one like our world, one a different world, where mass and charge, where every instantiation of mass was flipped with every instantiation of charge. And so the mass role was therefore flipped with the charge role, but everything else remains the same. These two worlds would be indistinguishable from the inside, right? I mean, we can say more about that in the Q&A if you want, but I think it's generally accepted that those worlds would be indistinguishable from the inside. So if you're a kind of empiricist here, if you kind of empiricist tendencies, these kind of indistinguishable worlds just seem awkward to you. They seem like there's some reason for thinking that these two worlds where mass and charge are switched are not in fact two different worlds, right? Both of them cannot exist. Okay, so good. So here's a different view. Here's another pretty intuitive and compelling view. It's humanism, right? So take humanism to be the denial of necessary connections between distinct existences. So often this is cashed out in terms of like the Humean mosaic and then either supervenience on the mosaic or reduction to the mosaic. But regardless of whatever like positive metaphysical view you have, we're taking humanism to be the negative metaphysical view about the denial of necessary connections between distinct existences. Right. And there's something interesting about humanism, the interaction of humanism and Nomic Essentialism. And I think because they're both motivated by in some sense, the same kind of empiricist ideas, right? The Humean, the Humean is often worried about indistinguishable worlds too, right? The Humean is often worried about worlds with the same mosaic but different laws, which would be indistinguishable from the inside. And they take it that it's an advantage to their view that typically they say that those things are not possible, right? They say that there can't be multiple worlds with the same mosaic and different laws. So kind of in a very big picture way, both Humeans and Normic Essentialists worry about there being features of the world that kind of outrun our grasp of the world. They have this kind of empiricist tendency, right? Or at least a lot of them. And so if we are inclined towards empiricism, it seems like it would be nice to combine these views to have, that is, a Humean Nomic Essentialism. But I mean, the standard view is just that we can't have a Humean Nomic Essentialism, right? And I think this is just like generally accepted in the literature. And this is because Nomic Essentialism seems to imply necessary connections between distinct existences. So to see this, just look at the toy scientific law that's on the handout, right? So whenever a spatial point has property A at time t, tn, then it comes to have property B at the next time tn plus 1, and assume A and B are fundamental properties here. So according to the Nomic Essentialist, this law is metaphysically necessary. So any world where it looks like A's are not followed by B's is in fact, according to the Nomic Essentialist, a world without A's and a world without B's. Right? This is just another way of saying that properties have their nomic roles necessarily. Right? So, and then it seems like that, if that's right, then we just have a necessary connection between distinct existences. That is, we have a necessary connection between A and B. And so on this Nomic Essentialist view, this toy law seems to involve necessary connections between distinct existences, and so seems to be in conflict with humanism. And of course, this generalizes to more realistic laws. There's nothing about the toy law, which is particularly special, right? So it seems like we have a tension here, right, between these views. Nomic Essentialism seems to involve necessary connections between distinct existences, and so seems to be in conflict with humanism. So do you know what else? Seems like it implies necessary connections between distinct existences, and so is in conflict with humanism. Quantum entanglement. So when two electrons are on opposite sides of a lab but in an entangled state, it seems like there's a necessary connection between their states. Like, we're not going to go into detail here because I'm sure like everyone here actually knows the problem, right? But the thought is that if the predictions of quantum mechanics are correct, then entangled particles exhibit behavior that can't be explained in terms of distinct intrinsic physical properties of each of the electrons, right? And so there seems to be a necessary connection between these two electrons, between these two particles, and they appear to be distinct existences. So it seems like we have a problem with humanism here. So to be clear, the Humean is used to necessary connections existing. The Humean has plenty of necessary connections in their view. After all, the Humean does believe in laws of nature, and that is, so they believe in some states necessitating some other states, right? But the cases of entanglement, the cases of Nomic Essentialism seem particularly problematic for the Humean because in those cases, the necessary connections are between entities which are intuitively fundamental. And when two entities are fundamental, we know that they're distinct existences, right? And so it seems like in these cases, we do have necessary connections between distinct existences. But notice, for entities that are non-fundamental, the Humean has a very clear strategy for making sense of the necessary connections between them. The Humean just needs to argue for any necessary connections that they want to accept between these entities which are non-fundamental, that those entities are not distinct existences. So on a grounding-based conception of what it is to be a distinct existence, this means arguing that one of the entities is grounded in the other, or they have a common ground. And so this points towards a kind of strategy that the Humean can use to make sense both of entanglement cases, but also of the intuitions of Nomic Essentialism, right? They can say that maybe contrary to initial appearances, in these cases, the necessary connections here are between entities which are non-fundamental and are not distinct existences. So this is the kind of strategy that we're going to implement, and Z is going to now talk about how to implement this strategy using the kind of two-state Humean approach that we developed in a prior paper. So I'll hand over to Z.
Great, thanks so much, Harjit. So in the remainder of this talk, I'm going to sketch out our account, which we call two-state Humeanism, which we introduced in our paper, What the Humean Should Say About Entanglement, and describe how it is able to deal with, kind of very briefly, problems of entangled states and non-separability in quantum mechanics, and in particular, highlight how The kind of answer we give there is one that will allow us to give a similar sort of answer in the Nomic Essentialism case. Then I'm going to get more specific, describe and outline an argument that we give that, as a matter of fact, not only is it possible, but in fact we can and do by one of the two states that our two-state Humean admits of is something that satisfies the Nomic Essentialist intuition. And finally, I'll look at some limitations and significance of that argument. Great. So the first thing I want to do is just talk about what two-state Humeanism is. So two-state Humeanism is an account that will hopefully allow us to make sense of there being necessary connections between things that seem fundamental, despite the fact that that on its own looks like it would force us towards necessary connections between distinct existences, because for reasons that Harjit just described. So two-state Humeanism is a variant of the best systems account. I'm not going to say what the best systems account except as what is necessary to make the contrast. According to the best systems account, the laws of nature are the axioms of that system that best systematizes the mosaic, that is, best balances simplicity and strength or informativeness about the mosaic. And so what it is, according to the best systems account, for a best systems account Humean, for the ordinary BSA, what it is for there to be laws and for the laws to have certain content and characteristics is for there to be a best system. So the existence and nature of the laws is grounded in there being a system of the appropriate kind and that system being the best one. Great. So the main feature that the two-state Humean account offers is that it allows us a systematic and general way that we can make sense of allowing other kinds of physical ontology to be grounded in the mosaic as a whole by way of the best system along the same lines. It's best understood by thinking about how this works in a particular case. The key innovation here is that we have a liberalization in the language in which a system can be formulated. The ordinary BSA has a restriction on its language in order to avoid things like the predicate F problem. The restriction on the original BSA is that the only predicates it includes are ones that denote perfectly natural properties and relations. That is, the perfectly natural properties and relations instantiated in the mosaic. We'll call those perfectly natural properties and relations in the mosaic the M state, and we'll call the predicates that denote them M state predicates. M here just for mosaic. And by a liberalization of the language that a system can be formulated in, we literally mean that you can include any additional language over and above those M state predicates into your best system. The easiest way of understanding this is with a predicate, but you could do it with other things like a wave function or an entire separate configuration space or what have you. But this sort of comes in steps, though ultimately the steps kind of merge all together at the end. The first step is that we introduce an L state predicate into a system. L state predicates are inherently meaningless. They don't bring with them, that is, they don't bring with them any inherent meaning. They come in uninterpreted. So on their own, L state predicates count as a sort of hit against simplicity and contribute nothing to informativeness. So merely introducing an L state predicate can never on its own be a benefit for a system. However, L state predicates can be imbued with an interpretation by being connected to other predicates, that is, to M state predicates or to other L state predicates by appearing in laws with them. Because again, the systems are these systems of sentences. And so if we have an L state predicate that appears in certain sentences with an M state predicate like mass or something else, then there will be features of what that predicate means based on its connection via those laws to these other predicates. And this is the sort of the way that this story is meant to resemble how laws of nature are grounded in the whole mosaic by way of the best system. The existence of L state properties and relations or any other part of the physical ontology that counts as part of the L state. Here the L is counting for laws. The existence and nature of the L state properties obtains in virtue of their existing the corresponding L state predicates with the corresponding interpretation. That is, what those properties are like is just determined by there being those predicates and those predicates having that interpretation that they got from appearing in the system. And so what this allows us to have is an account of physical ontology on which that ontology is non-fundamental. In a metaphysical sense, while still allowing that it be physically fundamental. That is, things like entanglement relationships, the wave function, or various other whatever kinds of things you wanted to include, like a configuration space and the wave function defined on that, or a guidance equation, any of the sort of distinctively quantum mechanical and distinctively non-separable features of that would give rise to entanglement phenomena may be physically fundamental in that they are part of the basic language and core concepts of our physics without being ungrounded. That is, without being metaphysically fundamental. And so according to the two-state Humean, any part of the L state may be physically fundamental, but it is not metaphysically fundamental, because to be a part of the L state is to be grounded in the mosaic as a whole. Cool. So you will hopefully already begin to see how this could help us with a Humean Nomic Essentialist picture. Because again, this is a general account. It's not restricted to anything about quantum mechanics. It rather just allows for any piece of physical ontology to be incorporated into the L state and grounded in the mosaic in this way, grounded in the M state and the best system of it. And in particular, because elements of the L state are all grounded in the mosaic as a whole by way of the best system, what this means is that if you have, for example, the two properties A and B, like in our toy law that Harjit described, that are necessarily correlated, you can have those properties exhibit a necessary connection without violating any Humean principles, because A and B, if they are part of the L state, are not distinct existences. They have, in fact, the same ground, though the route by which they get grounded might be different, since they'll sort of go by way of different L state predicates. Great. So that is the gist of how we can get from our two-state Humean picture to the possibility of a Humean Nomic Essentialism that is able to both remain genuinely Humean without giving up on the strength of Nomic Essentialism. Cool. We can go a bit further and argue that, as a matter of fact, if you are a two-state Humean, then L state properties already, without having to bring up any modification of the view or do anything else, already satisfy Nomic Essentialist intuitions. We'll understand these intuitions as being characterized by a principle that we're calling identity role link. That is, it's just a link between, just a link between, I know, the identity of some properties, but the identity of a pair of physical properties and the gnomic role that those properties play. Here is roughly how this connection should go. So identity role link says that two properties instantiated at different possible worlds are the same property if and only if they play the same gnomic role. We have a premise argument, sort of three-step argument, that can get you from the sameness of the properties to the sameness of gnomic role by way of some steps that hold true of two-state Humeanism. Roughly, the very, very quick version of this is that from that two L state properties are identical, just in case the predicates that refer to them have the same interpretation. Then the second premise is that the L state predicates have the same interpretation if those predicates play the same role in the best system. And the third premise is that playing the same role in the best system just means that the properties that those things denote play the same gnomic role. And so we get a direct connection between predicates, or the properties being identical and them playing the same gnomic role, and that gives us identity role link. This is only something that will hold, however, for L state properties. So I'll go through it a bit more slowly and explain how it could be that this holds for these properties according to two-state Humeanism. Great. So the first premise is that two L state properties are the same, just in case they are denoted by L state predicates with the same interpretation. You recall, according to two-state Humeanism, are you okay? Okay. According to two-state Humeanism, two L state properties exist in virtue of there being a L state predicate that denotes them, and it is only the the interpretation of that L state predicate that determines any of their characteristics. That is, there is nothing that distinguishes L state properties besides what the predicate is and what the interpretation of that predicate is that denotes them. And so if you have two predicates with the same interpretation, then they will they will ground the same L state property. Cool. Premise 2 is that two L state predicates that appear in best systems in their respective worlds have the same interpretation just in case they play the same role in their respective best systems. This follows from the fact that L state predicates do not carry with them an inherent built-in meaning or interpretation. They are introduced uninterpreted and gain an interpretation by appearing in sentences of the best system in a way that connects them to other predicates, whether that's other M state predicates or other L state predicates. In other words, two L state predicates gain an interpretation just by playing a certain role in the best system. And so if two L state predicates in two different worlds in the corresponding best systems play the same role in that system, they will thereby have the same interpretation. Great. The third premise is that for two L state predicates to play the same role in their respective best systems is just the same thing as the nomic roles of the properties or relations they denote to be the same. This just follows from the ways in which that the best system is supposed to kind of encode information about the mosaic, namely that it is something composed of these axioms which are its laws. And so the facts about how that predicate appears in those various laws and how it connects to other predicates and how those predicates appear with other predicates in different laws, that is both the role of that predicate in the system, but it also directly describes what the nomic role of that property is. That's certainly true if we take it for just the ordinary Humean and an M state property, and it is also true for the two state Humean and an L state property. In fact, even more so, because we know that for the L state properties, they're in fact, that is all they are, is those predicates being that way. Great. Once we get that, now we have a conclusion that is exactly identity role link restricted to L state properties. That is, for two L state properties instantiated at two different worlds to be the same is just for them to play the same nomic roles at their respective worlds. Right. So that is the argument that if you are a two-state Humeanism, that if you are a two-state Humean, you are already satisfying the Nomic Essentialist intuitions insofar as they can be restricted to the L state. There's an obvious limitation in this account that sort of comes out of the last sentence I just said, namely that the L state is the only one of the states that the two-state Humean is able to give this Nomic Essentialist account for. And this is an issue because while you could be the kind of boring version of a two-state Humean that only had an M state, a two-state Humean cannot only have an L state. The way that L states work requires there to be a mosaic about which there is a system. And so there must be at least something in the M state, in the mosaic, for the rest of the system to systematize. What this means is that there is no way, strictly speaking, for a two-state Humean to remove all quiddities from their account. They will have to admit of whatever is in the M state as something just like any ordinary Humean, as being a quidistic type of property that does not have its nomic role essentially. But there are still some ways you can lessen this blow. In particular, you can get away as a two-state Humean with very few things in the mosaic. Importantly, one of the accounts that we discuss in the paper, and I think in the original paper as well, something we call positions first Humeanism, which I think has been defended by some folks, maybe Mike at some point. That is basically an account on which the only things in the world are positions, and that every other thing, you get another version of this from Esfeld and Deckert, and that every other thing that exists in the world is grounded in just those positions. And so for the Humean, for the two-state Humean, what this means is that the M state consists only of the positions of intrinsically identical particles, and that the system in the L state contains the entire rest of the physical ontology. This kind of positions first picture would give you the vast majority of your physical ontology being something about which being something which satisfies Nomic essentialist intuitions, the only exception being position. And it's not obvious if that's a problem. I mean, partially if you think that the problems with quiddities are the things that Harjit was describing earlier in the talk, namely these issues, these sort of epistemic problems and problems of property switching and so on, then having only one of them is not going to be an issue. You can't switch one property. You always know it's that one. And moreover, it's not obvious whether we should think of position especially as being the kind of thing that should have its nomic role. Essentially, it seems like if anything, position has a sort of metaphysically determined role that is kind of metaphysically upstream of nomic characteristics. And in some sense, position is always the same, even though the laws change around it. But regardless, that is a limitation, and we're acknowledging that. You might, so this, I know I've got like only a couple more minutes, so I will keep going very quickly right at the end. You might recognize that everything that we've said up to this point about the kind of positive advantage that we can get is described purely in modal terms. We're talking about a necessary correspondence between when two properties are identical and when they play the same nomic role. And that sort of gets you the modal character of Nomic essentialism, but you might think that it's missing out on some kind of the essentialist part of it, right? What it is that says that to be mass is, it's not just that mass couldn't not play the mass role, and but rather that what it is to be mass is to be the thing that plays the mass role. And what it is to be the thing that plays the mass role is to be mass. Where's that essentialist part, you may ask? And it's true that our the argument that we give, strictly the identity role link is just understood as a sort of nomic or a modal necessary correspondence. We think that there are actually good prospects for the two-state Humean to satisfy the Nomic essentialist intuition as well. In particular, our account of what it is to be something like mass, if mass is part of the L state, or something like charge or what have you, is one that has the nomic role metaphysically upstream of the existence and nature of the property. That is, if mass is part of the L state, then the existence of mass and the nature of mass as a property obtains in virtue of the best systematization of the world, including a predicate, a mass predicate that plays a certain role in the various laws included in that best system. And so in some sense, it is the nomic role that gives rise to the existence and nature of the property, and I can't think of anything that's would be more satisfying to whatever that essentialist intuition is than that. Time. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, we can answer other questions about that or say more things about entanglement in the Q&A.